It's December 2023, and that's unusual for me to be in front of the camera. But I have located documents about the United Church 100 years, only to 1993. I have no idea who compiled this, but it involves Nipigon, Red Rock, and Cameron Falls, and I think it's an important piece of history that I would like to read. And this starts out saying in 1926, we were already talking about the history. But in 1893, Grace United Church, as we know it today, began its history in the Nipigon Presbyterian Church. Services were held in the CPR station, and a minister from Schreiber often came to do the services. Around 1899, Dr. Robertson organized the congregation to purchase land from the CPR on 2nd Street to build a church. They let it be known that any congregation could have the use of the church building for services. Mr. and Mrs. Bill McCurdy were early mainstays and leaders of the church at this time. And of course, if you live in Nipigon, you know that McCurdy is recognized by the name on McCurdy Avenue. Mrs. McCurdy played the organ, entertained visiting ministers in her home, and she gathered the women around and formed a ladies' aid and taught Sunday school. Over the years, the Ladies' Aid was responsible for financing couples club, senior citizen events, and bought a church organ. Mr. McCurdy built the wooden pews, which were used until 1961, and that would be when the church built a new church, and the pews were not large enough. Later, a basement was added to the building, along with a kitchen, a Sunday school room, and addition across the back. In 1925, the United Church of Canada was formed, uniting Presbyterian, Methodist, and Congregational churches, and so the Presbyterian Church of Nipigon was absorbed and became the Nipigon United Church. 1927 was the first resident minister for the Nipigon United Church, and it was Reverend Wright. 1929, a traveling minister was here visiting, doing the services. 1931 to 1940 was a Mr. Frank Ward, a lay minister who served in Nipigon. He lived in the little room at the back of the church. Mr. Ward was well known in Nipigon. He often had the boys out, teenage boys, as a boys' club, and Johnny All and Billy Millen both remember going outdoor trips with him and taking part in many, many outdoor hikes. He lived in Manitoba for a while, but returned to Nipigon after he was suffering from cancer. Mr. Ward died, and he is buried in the Nipigon Cemetery. It's mentioned that during this decade, a period of 4 years passed when Nipigon was served by various student ministers. In 1940, Reverend Alan Barber was a student minister here. He stayed from July till September when he returned to college. In 1941, Mr. Alexander, a student, came to the Nipigon United Church. So Reverend Lawheed was a United Church minister and served when he was visiting from England. He came to visit his sister in Thunder Bay and came and preached at the church. Then we get to the more familiar names. Reverend McIver became frequently a minister. He traveled into Nipigon on the mail train, stayed with Bernice and Toiva Lorla, and they would take him out to Cameron Falls for an afternoon service, and then he would go back to Fort William on the evening train. By 1944, Reverend Dan Tansley and his wife arrived in the community, hardworking, capable individuals. At this time, the Nipigon Beardmore pastoral charge was financed by local congregations. A grant was received yearly to keep it going. 1945, regular services were held twice monthly in Cameron Falls. Sunday school was the only community youth program at this time. At 1945, the choir in Nipigon was reorganized under Mrs. Tansley. Choir members included people like Audrey Halmy, Helen Sancy, who became Helen Wheeler, Donna Williams, Margaret Millen, Billy Millen's sister, Doris Murdoch, Ruth Everett, Mr. Everett's daughter, Ann Patton, Evelyn Martin, who became Evelyn Larson, Isla Corpy, who became Isla Rojo, and Thelma Lofquist. In 1946, Reverend Tansley suffered minor injuries and a broken nose when the church bell fell from the tower as he was ringing it one Sunday morning. Later in the year, the church tower was struck by lightning and the weather vane was knocked down. The Nipigon, Beardmore, Cameron Falls pastoral charge became active as a three-church charge, and they met frequently with people like in Beardmore, the McGills, the Pawns, the Robinsons, the Smiths. In Cameron Falls, it was the Lindberghs. In Nipigon, it was Corners, Doris, Millens, and Frasers, Warren Miller, Bill Wade, and Johnny Sharp. In the church archives, there is an honor roll listing some of the men who were away at war, and the roll of honor included Norman Gordon, David Gordon, Richard Gordon, Olie Steen, Clyde Patton, Harold Steen, George Perrin, Douglas Ainsley, Ragnar Larson, Johnny All, Alec Fraser, Howard Millen, Douglas Ring, and Arthur Shalander. In 1947, Reverend Tansley and the congregation organized a fundraising to repair and improve the church. Imagine, an objective of $1,000 was for a new basement furnace, remodel it, an addition to provide midweek services and recreation facilities. A manse was also built next door and is presently a private home. A junior choir was organized by Mrs. Tansley, included people like Doris Murdoch, Margaret Millen, Myrna Tumala, Lorna Foster, Donna Foster, Brian Williams, Wilfred Jones, Jimmy Smart, Douglas Schultz, and Gerald Smith. One Easter in 1948, the choir wore white gowns for the first time, and everyone gave a $1 contribution for the material, and the balance was paid by an interested friend. A couples club was formed, and they presented a 3-act comedy entitled Where's Grandma? The church was well known for having its plays and skits for the community. Teenagers of the congregation formed the intermediate Sunday school class. They held bowling tournaments and monthly evening outings at each other's houses. The junior boys went to camp this year at Loon Lake, and there is still a camp, even in 2023. In 1950, the pastoral charge now includes Red Rock. Cecil and Vera Hall gathered 100 signatures so they could establish a congregation. A young people's society was formed and lasted until 1953. In 1951, the first meeting of the Red Rock United Church congregation was held in St. Peter's Church, with Reverend Searle as the chairman. As the building was originally a community church, the congregation made an agreement with the Anglicans to share premises and finance costs. Since that time, the capital building expenditures such as a roof, a basement renovations, a new furnace, a new organ have been shared equally. At Cameron Falls, there was a women's aid group of 16 members. They organized banquets, bazaars, catering, traveling baskets. They collected used clothing for overseas relief and had old woolen blankets made up for homes for the aged. In 1956, Red Rock Sunday School had an enrollment of 81 pupils, with an average attendance of 71, and there were 13 teachers. It's mind-boggling for me as I read this to think of that now, when we're lucky if we have 2 or 3 children who come to church. 1957, Reverend Johnson left Nipigon and was replaced by Reverend Gavrill. The WA held a gala Christmas party and invited people from the other church, such as Mrs. Laura Wade, May Turner, and Ada Stanley. In charge of decorating were Mrs. McConkey, Mary Stewart, and Mrs. Ann Donaldson. Mrs. Lettinen Mrs. Lorela and Mrs. Broughton took care of the menu. In 1959, the United Church ministers took part with other ministers in the district in an inauguration of the district high school in Red Rock. At the workshop for Sunday school was held in Cameron Falls Public School, and a Christmas juvenile choir held a first candlelight service in 7 languages. In 1960, an Easter Sunday service was held at the Lookout above town with Reverend Gavril, and the ladies of the church catered to an Easter breakfast. And as late as 2022, we are still holding those Easter sunrise services. The senior choir, consisting of 23 members under the direction of Midge Peel, who at this time is still alive, living in a home in Thunder Bay, and they won first place in a music festival in Geraldton. Mrs. Walter was director of the junior choir. After 4 years of planning, a sod turning ceremony was held on April 23, 1961 at 5th Street, site of the new church. The name of the church was changed to Grace United, and dedication took place in October 1961. I get lost here. Red Rock, Beardmore, Cameron Falls took part in the services. The junior and senior choirs sang "Bless This House." The church was described in a newspaper article at the time as a very modern $50,000 building with a seating of 150 people. The building committee included Jetta Jones, Murray Wilson, Frank Polnicki, Bob Matchett, John Sharp, Ernie Smith, and E.C. Everett. 1962, religious leaders of different denominations met at Cameron Falls to discuss and question the different ways the Roman Catholic and the Protestants held services. Father Meyer, Reverend Gibbs, Reverend Kaya, and Reverend Gravel. WA and WMS were joined to make a women's organization, which was the United Church Women. Some of those charter members are Marion Wessner, Maureen Manila, who at this time still lives in Thunder Bay, Clara Patton, Lorraine Wilson, Ann Donaldson, Doris Lake, Anita Lang, Impy Pink, Bernice Lorela, Ino Fraser, Audrey Crawford, Monica Gavril, and Wilma Gordon, who also at this time resides in Thunder Bay. 1963 was a bidding of a pastoral charge that was represented by Presbyterian Conference of lay ministers. In June 1963, a newsletter had an invitation to all congregation members to join in a picnic at Stewart Lake. Mention is made of bake sales being held to raise money for a new organ. In June, a dinner party was held at a Mexican theme. Reverend Gavril's farewell service was held in June. He leaves after 6 years of growth and development of the church in Nipigon. He was instrumental in constructing the new church and active in the Nipigon Home and School Association, chairman of the Nipigon Transient Welfare Agency, taught religion in the schools, and was district chaplain of the Algoma Masonic District and a member of Superior Lodge. On July 4th, an induction service was held for Reverend Skabinski. In September 1966, another new minister appeared, Dr. Reverend Sly. Dr. Sly was a former minister at United Church in Winnipeg, was born in Schreiber, and moved to Nipigon with his wife and 4 sons. The sermon was given by Dr. McPherson on his induction into the church. One of the things he said was, "In our Christian faith we are witnesses. That the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that Jesus took the garb of this particular time and went into the world as a servant." New members were welcomed into the church in 1966, included Phil Douglas, who was married to Ethel Miller, and Ethel and Phil became very, very active in the church over the next few years. Mrs. Margie Rocky also transferred into United Church. Reverend Ken Moffat came to be guest speaker annually at anniversary services. Reverend Sly was nominated as a federal NDP candidate for Thunder Bay riding. This riding was represented at the time by Bob Andrus. Reverend Sly is quoted as saying, "It's time for Northwestern Ontario to make some noise. Time for us to stop being known as the backwoods of Canada." In 1967, an open house was held at Grace United Church with an India display organized by Rita Agarwal of Red Rock. Churches in Nipigon work to hold a centennial banquet for senior citizens. This continues today. In 1968, Grace United sponsored a 26-mile walkathon between Nipigon and Red Rock under Doug Sly, known as Miles for Millions. Over 8,000 miles were walked by with a total of more than 5,000 raised. Can't remember how many students and adults took place, but we had kids as young as 5 years old taking part in that walk to Red Rock. Barry Belanger of Nipigon collected $4.10 a mile. Maureen Harvey, Dr. Harvey's wife, collected $5.62 a mile. The young people who finished included Connie Bosch, age 7, Terry Wright, aged 8, Susan Legacy, age 9, Tommy Savioya, 9, and Vincent Leapins, age 10. The Boys Club was active at this time and known as the Nipigon Ventures. Some of them were Tommy Gordon, Dale Clark, Paul Rickenen, Kenny Plemmel, Norman Lorla, Rodney Larson, Bruce Atkinson, Mike McDonough, and Terry Hurd. And some of those young men still live in Nipigon today. Some of the fundraising activities included grass cutting, shoveling snow, and collecting bottles. In 1969, it was sometime in the late 60s that Cameron Falls Church was closed and members transferred to the church in Nipigon. Scenery and props for the 1969 White Gift Service were prepared by Mrs. Kay Nagus, who was the minister's wife. A trumpet solo was played by Benny Gordon and Gordon Sly. A violin duet was performed by Grace Atkinson and Muriel Moore. And participating in the candlelighting service were Susan Criff, Barbara Nikinen, Irene Atkinson, and Lillian Braun. In 1970, Sunday school teachers included Mrs. Nagus, Mrs. Nikinen, Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Nemi, and Mr. Doug Sly. In 1971, the organist was Esther Chan. And when the mortgage burning ceremony took place in 1974, there was a celebration and a luncheon held in the church hall. Mrs. Bernice Lorla read the history of the church, and Jerry Brennan was the ceremony. And a letter of congratulations was read from Reverend Gavril. And around 1964, 65, I'm going to check that. 1973, I'm wrong. 1973, Reverend Walt Gibbons and his wife Dina came to the congregation, and Walt Gibbons was a blind minister, but he taught the community that being blind was not a disadvantage. He was in and out of every school in the community. He was well known for his music ability, his guitar and his singing, and the kids would flock to sit with him when he appeared in the schools, and he became known for entertaining people, being there to put on plays, always organizing things like that. And at the church we have a long play record by him, and his theme song was Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog. You didn't have to be a United Church person to know that that was one of the songs he would sing. He would be singing at the fishing festival. And one time at the fishing festival, being a very large man, he was asked to be on a tug-of-war team, and he was the anchor man for the tug-of-war that year. And some people may recall that Dina had to do all the driving, and they were coming home from Thunder Bay one time, came around the corner at Wilmette Canyon, and rolled their vehicle right across the ditch. And fortunately, no serious injuries. But they were well liked in Nipigon, and spent a lot of time in the community rather than just in the school. In the church, but in the schools for sure. 1983, the Nipigon Church Council included people like Karen Harrison, Jeanette Jarvis, Jean Jones, Maureen Cusick, Maureen Manila, Doug Martin, Don Martin, Doreen Nipigon, Marty Sisk, Linda Thompson, Ron Thompson, Jerry Brennan, and Karen Park. And the Red Rock Council included people like Florence Houston, Ken Sutton, Nora Curry, Wilma Molinaro, Edna White, Jim McLeod, Doreen McLeod, Bella Kirby, Gail Wills, Rob Clark, and Margaret Willman. And the organist for many years at the Red Rock United Church was Doreen McLeod. Several other people contributed their musical talents to the organ was Wilson Billingsley, Jennifer Brown, Muriel Rampersad, Kathy Frost, Wendy Kirby, and Edna White. The charge of the United Church, with the several churches involved, celebrated its 90th anniversary with a service in Red Rock. Guest speaker was Reverend Ann Beattie, and there was a joint choir from Nipigon and Red Rock taking part. 1984, a leap year smorg was held, and the committee was headed by Doreen Nipigon. In March, Grace United hosted a World Day of Prayer. Ed Prinzler visited and showed slides on Grenada. He participated in the church service during the Nipigon's first homecoming. Confirmation classes were held in Red Rock and included people like Sheeta Sodergan, Scott Young, Stephen Spurka, and John Spurka. 5 fir trees from the Recreation Committee were planted at Grace United Church probably in June, and now 30 years later, 2023, we've had to cut a couple of those trees down because they became endangered. A Pedal for Peace supper was organized by Karen Harrison and Jeanette Jarvis. On May 19th, a farewell was held for Jim and Doreen McLeod, for Bert and Jeanette Jarvis. In August, a farewell for Bonnie and Richard Patterson. Tom, Richard, and Jane Chan and Bill Barnes were all received into the church, and the Chans became very, very active, both in the community and in the church. On December 15th, a family Christmas sleigh ride was held in Hercot, with hot dogs and chocolate served afterwards. Doreen and Miriam Nipigon gave a presentation on their trip to the Holy Land. Miriam is still active in the community. In November, Reverend Wayne Larstone, president of Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario Conference, spoke to anniversary service in Nipigon. In 1987, the church council included people like Jetta Jones, Jerry Brennan, Don Dorian, Phyllis Govan, Maureen Cusick, Don Martin, Cheryl Meikle, Doreen Nipigon, Miriam Nipigon, and Marguerite White. And on the February following, confirmed into the church were people like Julia DeChico, Stacy DeChico, Jennifer Elliott, Michael Elliott, Cheryl Martin, Christopher Martin, Warren Douglas, Eddie Killar, Jennifer Petrick, and Aaron Sodergan. And this group was called the God Squad. No idea why. Reverend James introduced the concept of a cedar supper, which was held on Maundy Thursday. A farewell luncheon was held in June for Barb Janes, and in August the congregation welcomed new minister Ed Prinzler and his wife Wilhelmina. In the fall, Wilhelmina Prinzler took over the leadership of the Sunday school in Nipigon. In 1989, Wendy Clifton, Wilhelmina Prinzler, and Marguerite White arranged 5 meetings for the Women's Concern Group. Bernice Laura still was convening a foster parents plan for the church, where they supported 2 foster children. In 1990, the year of the theme was Spring Flowers. In 1991, the Prinslers hosted a Granada evening at the church and again shared their experience in this interesting and beautiful country. The anniversary service was held in Red Rock on November 4th. In 1992, on Palm Sunday, the Charge hosted Trinity Choir and the Image Dancers from Thunder Bay. Guests were Jack and Eleanor McLean, and they gave a presentation on Japan. In 1993, June saw the farewell and retirement of Ed and Wilhelmina Prinzler, and the new minister Joyce Fergus Moore, her husband and daughter Peter and Emma were welcomed in August, and we hope their ministry will be a happy and fruitful one for the people of Nipigon. And the 100 years ends at that point. But I'm sure that the congregation at United Church will now make an effort to finish up the next 30 years because Joyce Fergus Moore, Dr. Daniel Gilroy, Roberta Bear, Scott Gale, and have history with the church. And we now have visiting ministers that come every time. So it's important for the histories of all the churches to be recorded. And I hope that as the first one, we can now do them with the rest of the churches. Thank you very much.